The book of Isaiah offers a miniature Bible. It has 66 chapters. There are 66 books in the Bible. Isaiah is divided into two divisions. The first division speaks of law, the second of grace. The first division has 39 chapters in it. There are 39 books in the Old Testament. The second division has 27 chapters. Well, there are 27 books in the New Testament. Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me Isaiah Miniature Bible.
And by the way, J.R., what we're talking about is the structure of Isaiah, just as we've talked about the structure of the entire Bible, corresponding to the Hebrew alphabet, each letter having a meaning, and the alphabet taken as a whole represents an outline, shall we say, of various topics. And on our last broadcast, we had just talked about chapter 17 of Isaiah, which corresponded to the letter Lamed. And that, of course, corresponds with the book of Esther in the Old Testament. And what it really is talking about is the wife of Jehovah finding herself in trouble, just as Esther did in the court of Ahasuerus, and then coming to the rescue of her people. Well, J.R., in Isaiah 17, we found the people being rescued from their arch enemy, Damascus.
Yes. In chapter 18 of Isaiah, we have what I feel is the chapter that deals with the Mem and corresponds with the book of Job.
The book of Job. What a strange book Job is, because here Satan comes before the throne of God and says, you know, that Job, your servant Job, if you really let me test him, he will blaspheme your name. And God said, I'll let you test him. And Job then goes through this series of horrible tests, losing his family, losing everything, having a horrible skin disease. And J.R., it's fascinating that the skin is mentioned in this section of Isaiah, chapter 18, corresponding to Mem. It's interesting.
You know, the Mem has to do with water. And we have here, and by the way, with waters comes floods, just overwhelming trouble. That's what Job suffered, you see, the overwhelming floods of trouble. Here, for example, it mentions it sendeth ambassadors by the sea, and so we see its relationship to Mem. But also in this Job, Job suffered just as the black Jews of Ethiopia have suffered. I think that's what this chapter is referring to, the black Jews of Ethiopia.
I think you're absolutely correct. In the second verse of Isaiah 18, it says, Go ye swift messengers to a nation scattered and peeled, to a people terrible from their beginning hitherto, a nation meted out and trodden down, whose land the rivers have spoiled. There we have the two qualities of this letter, the rivers, which is water, and the testing, or the revelation of testing, shall we say, the same revelation of testing we have in Job. You picture Job sitting in the ashes, you know, and just having a horrible affliction. And this is the picture we have of this nation scattered and peeled.
Yes. And you know, this is, you spoke of revealed there, the revelation. There's something, I think, here in the 18th chapter of Isaiah that's going to be revealed, don't you think?
Well, you've been saying it for years. Why don't you read that verse, because that's interesting.
Verse 7, In that time shall the present be brought unto the Lord, to the place of the name of the Lord of hosts, the Mount Zion. And I feel like this is the long-lost Ark of the Covenant is going to be brought back to Jerusalem and revealed. Fascinating. Well, chapter 19 of Isaiah deals with the letter Nun, or follows the theme of the meaning of the letter Nun, and also with the Psalms.
Yeah, the book of Psalms corresponds to this letter. Psalms being the history of Israel, marching through difficulties. The prophetic history of Israel, if you will, verse by verse. This is Isaiah's inversion of that, because the Nun represents downfall and rising again. Downfall that foreshadows a later rising. And we have here a prophecy against Egypt, and we have Egypt being just totally decimated in this chapter. Downfall.
Yeah, only to rise again.
Only to rise again. In fact, it says in verse 19, In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt. How strange. Rising again.
Yeah, and you know, mentioning also the Psalms. The Psalms tell the story of the rising again of Israel. Well, we have here in Isaiah chapter 19, the people of Judah. Verse 17 says, the land of Judah shall be a terror unto Egypt. So that's a rising again, isn't
Yes,
it,
it is. It really
for
is.
Israel. Now we come to chapter 20 of Isaiah and its corresponding letter, Samech. It also deals with the theme found in the book of Proverbs.
Samech, a very interesting letter that it's a circle, basically. It's formed as a circle, and it represents the encircling power of God, like a wall of protection around a believer. It also represents the tabernacle and the temple for the same reasons, and it represents signs that one keeps for memory. That is to say, the Hebrew word simanim begins with the letter Samech, and it's the word for signs. These signs help people on earth to remember what God has done, to never let those things drop from their mind.
Yeah, and there is a sign used here in this chapter, isn't there?
The very word. Verse 3 says, and the Lord said, like as my servant Isaiah hath walked naked and barefoot 3 years for a sign and a wonder upon Egypt and upon Ethiopia.
Fascinating. Chapter 21 of Isaiah deals with the letter Ayin, which represents the eye, and Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes, of course, being a book written from the point of view of the man on earth under the sun. And he says, all is vanity. I've looked it all over and I've decided there's nothing worth saving. It's a tired man on earth. Solomon's last word, having tried everything. And this is called, the corresponding book in Isaiah, chapter 21, is called a grievous vision, verse 2. And this vision
It deals with the eye, doesn't it?
deals with the eye.
How
Sure
about
does. And by the way, we have here the parable or the story of the watchman. We have the watchman, go set a watchman, let him declare what he seeth. And he sees a chariot, he sees a lion, he sees a lot of different things coming across the plain. But the idea is that we have a play here on the idea of a watchman. This is the eye of man.
Yeah.
And that's played off against the eye of God.
Verses 11 and 12 really point up that, don't they?
The burden of Dumah, or Edom, he calleth me out of Seir, watchman, what of the night? Watchman, what of the night? The watchman said, the morning cometh.
That's the eye.
The eye.
That's fascinating. Chapter 22 of Isaiah deals with the meaning of the letter Peh, which is the mouth, also with the Song of Solomon.
Song of Solomon, dealing with those things spoken of the Lord to his beloved. And, Isaiah has the grievous task of delivering a message to Jerusalem in apostasy. And this is called the burden of the valley of vision. We often find the eye and the mouth slightly interchanged. In verse 4 it says, therefore said I, look away from me, I will weep bitterly, labor not to comfort me, because of the spoiling of the daughter of my people.
There's that woman, or the Song of Solomon's bride, huh?
Right. Yeah, definitely. And the wife of Jehovah in difficulty. And it's fascinating, too, in verse 22 of this chapter, the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, so that he shall open and none shall shut, he shall shut and none shall open. This is Peh is called the closed mouth. There's a time for speaking, there's a time for listening. When it comes to declarations, there's a time when you should keep your mouth closed, there's a time when the mouth should be open, and that's the message of this letter. This is a statement, a divine proclamation against Jerusalem.
Isaiah chapter 23 is a very special chapter because this deals with Isaiah himself. It is corresponding to the 18th letter of the alphabet, Tzadi, which means the righteous, and Isaiah is that book.
Tzadi, the tzaddik. And you know what's fascinating here about this chapter is that righteousness wins out in this chapter. By the way, that's what happens in the book of Isaiah. There are judgments delivered against Israel, against Judah, against the nations. But in the end of Isaiah, we have the things of the Lord being declared. Well, that's exactly what we have here in chapter 23, including, by the way, we have the daughter of Tarshish mentioned in verse 10. We have in verse 14, howl, ye ships of Tarshish, for your strength is laid waste. J.R., we have the destruction here of the commercial system. The ships of Tarshish are a symbol of the world system.
Mystery Babylon.
Mystery Babylon.
That's the Tzadi, 18th letter. In fact, that's what we find in the Tzadi chapter of Revelation, isn't it?
18th chapter of Revelation, it's the destruction of commercial Babylon.
And the men stand on the decks of their ships out in the water and weep just like they do right here. How ye ships of Tarshish in verse 14.
But the very last verse of this chapter is interesting. And her merchandise and her hire shall be holiness to the Lord. This is in the end of days. It shall not be treasured nor laid up, for her merchandise shall be for them that dwell before the Lord. Isaiah is saying there's going to come a day when the merchandise of the world will be holy. It'll be set aside, dedicated to the Lord.
Wow. And that brings us, of course, to the Kof, the 19th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and its meaning of holiness. Isn't it amazing? The word holiness is used here in this last chapter, pointing to the next. That would be chapter 24, and I think it also refers to Jeremiah.
Now, the book corresponding, the chapters corresponding to the book of Jeremiah, chapter 24, begins with, on a very, very dark note, behold, the Lord maketh the earth empty, maketh it waste, turneth it upside down, scattereth abroad the inhabitants thereof. This is the way he begins. And during this chapter, this whole chapter, there is judgment of the most ferocious kind. For example, verse 20, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard. Yeah. All the systems of the planet will be shaken. But at the end of things, it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the host of the high ones that are on earth, the kings of earth are on earth. And the end of this is going to be holiness to the Lord. That is the shaking.
Yeah.
It's like you would take a box and shake it up, and the good comes to the top.
Yeah, no wonder Jeremiah was called the weeping prophet.
Oh, boy.
And that takes us to the next chapter also. Chapter 25 is also Kof, because that deals with Lamentations. And in the ancient past, Lamentations was a part of Jeremiah. So these two chapters are actually together in their meaning of the letter Kof.
Indeed.
Now we come to the 26th chapter of Isaiah, which corresponds, I think, to the prophecy of Ezekiel, and it deals with the letter Resh, which stands for wicked.
Yeah, the Hebrew word for wicked is rasha. That is the absolute, idea of somebody who is utterly depraved. Verse 10 of this chapter says, let favor be showed to the wicked, yet will he not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness will he deal unjustly, and will not behold the majesty of the Lord. In other words, the wicked here are beyond redemption. This is why they're being judged. Wickedness are, the wicked here, as in verse 14, are being pictured as unredeemable. Verse 14 says, they are dead, they shall not live. They are deceased, they shall not rise. Therefore hast thou visited and destroyed them to make, and made all their memory to perish. In other words, the wicked are going to catch theirs. There's no possibility of redemption. But J.R., in verse 20, it says, come, my people, enter thou into thy chambers, and shut thy doors about me. Hide thyself, as it were, for a little moment, till the indignation be overpast. Here's a promise to the righteous.
Yeah. Sound like a rapture, too,
It certainly does, doesn't it?
Now, Gary, these three letters, the Resh, the Kof, and the Tzadi, the wicked, on one side, the Tzadi, the righteous on the other side, and Kof in the middle, speaks of the second coming of Christ as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, the letter Kof, holiness to the Lord.
And growth cycles, that is the end of the cycle. This is the second coming of Christ.
The second coming of Christ.
Well, listen to chapter 25, if I can just digress just a few verses. It says, verse 7, he'll destroy in this mountain the face of the covering cast over all people, and the veil that is spread over all nations. He'll swallow up death in victory, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. This is the second coming, isn't it?
Wow, that's great. Now, we should point out that this is by no means a definitive and exhaustive study. We're touching on these sections to stimulate you to study the Bible. Extend this study into your own life.
Absolutely. And that brings us then to chapter 27, which corresponds to the Sheen, the letter that has to do with God's provision and taking care of us, El Shaddai. And it also tells us about a little something about Daniel, doesn't it?
As a matter of fact, the letter Sheen is called the letter of script, and it's also called the letter of divine provision. Support, provision, and script. And Daniel's script, that is his written word, the prophecy of Daniel, is perhaps the most compact and accurate history of the world ever written. Now here we have Israel in the kingdom. Chapter 27 of Isaiah. In that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent. Well, J.R., what is that?
Daniel chapter 7, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That's incredible. And you know, these meanings of the Hebrew letters comes from our book, The Mystery of the Menorah and the Hebrew Alphabet. And the work that we've done in here are an excellent method by which you can use, by which you can study the various alphabetic designs of Scripture, and in particular now, Isaiah. Well, that brings us then to the final letter, Tav, and the next 12 chapters of Isaiah, 28 through 39, and this deals with the 12 minor prophets. What's so fascinating to me, Gary, is that most of these chapters begin with woe to the crown of, or woe to Ariel, or woe to the rebellious children, and so on. That's the message of the minor prophets, isn't it?
It certainly is, because each of the 12 minor prophets, now the 12 minor prophets were originally a single book, a single scroll. And so they are the letter Tav, and each one of them pronounces a judgment followed by a restitution, or restoration. Hosea speaks of the restoration of Israel, Israel being the harlot who has gone astray, just like Hosea's wife Gomer. And he is faithful to her in spite of the fact that she doesn't deserve it. And in the end, she comes back and she is restored. And you know what's happens here in this in Hosea is that they have Jezreel to sow and to harvest.
And in this 28th chapter of Isaiah, verse 24 says, "Doth the plowman plow all day to sow? Doth he open and break the clods of his ground?" So that fits with the message of Hosea, doesn't it?
It really, really does.
You know, it's interesting to me that these 28 chapters, from chapter 28 through 39, these 12 chapters of Isaiah, actually cover the same theme. They are a package together. So Isaiah so perfectly fits the Old Testament. And that brings us then to chapter 29, also speaking of Tav, but this one deals with the prophecies in Joel.
Now Joel is the prophet of the day of the Lord. He says, and I'm just reading one section here, for verse 11, "For that day of the Lord is great and very terrible, and who can abide it?" This day of the Lord, of course, is the invasion of Judah.
Yeah, and chapter 29 opens with the same theme. "Woe to Ariel, the city where David dwelt. Add ye year to year, let them kill sacrifice yet. I will distress Ariel, and there shall be heaviness and sorrow." And so we can see the same theme as given in Joel. Then we come to chapter 30 of Isaiah, also a Tav chapter. This is the last letter of the alphabet, and it speaks of the theme in Amos.
Amos, of course, prophesies to Israel on the judgment of Damascus and Tyre and Edom and Moab, and Israel's judgment as well, I might add. Israel's judgment is said to be deserved, and it will be a future judgment. And Amos, I should say, says, "Woe unto you that desire the day of the Lord. To what end is it for you? The day of the Lord is darkness and not light."
Oh, Gary, that little woe right there so succinctly describes this chapter. It starts out with, "Woe to the rebellious children."
Wow.
How about that? Chapter 31 deals with Obadiah.
And Obadiah has a prophecy against Edom. But J.R., Edom is not just one little country. In the latter days, Edom is fallen man. Yeah. Edom becomes sinful man.
Becomes Adam, doesn't it?
Right.
And chapter 32 deals with the book of Jonah.
And Jonah, of course, is a godly man who was sent to ungodly people, the Ninevites, to preach. And he didn't want to preach to them. They were too wicked.
They were kind of churl, weren't they?
They were churlish.
And that's what chapter 32, verses 4 and 5 says. "The heart also of the rash shall understand knowledge, and the tongue of the stammerers shall speak plain, and the vile person shall be no more called liberal, nor the churl said to be Bountiful. Well, we come to chapter 33 in Micah.
Micah, of course, is a judgment on Samaria, judgment on Judah, the judgment on the prophets and the princes, and prophesying birth of the Messiah concerning Bethlehem Ephratah, and coming out of Judah.
Yeah. Well, chapter 34 deals with Nahum.
Nahum, of course, is a prophecy against Nineveh. This would be that churlish, ungodly individual.
Yeah, and Habakkuk is the book, I think, dealt with in chapter 35 of Isaiah.
Habakkuk, of course, is the man who deals with the subject of Babylon, J.R., because he says, why are you bringing Babylon against Israel to destroy her? Because we're more righteous than Babylon. He wrestles with God and asks that question.
He's the wrestler. Verse 3 says, strengthen ye the weak hands.
Yes, indeed.
Chapter 36 deals with Zephaniah.
And Zephaniah is the hidden prophet. He hides. God hides certain things, dealing particularly with Ethiopia.
And this is the chapter of Hezekiah. In fact, for the next 3 chapters, 36, 37, and 38, we have the story of Hezekiah, Sennacherib, and then Hezekiah's sickness where he gets well. Chapter 37 deals with Haggai.
Haggai, festival, celebration, and of course when Isaiah's prophecy dealing with recovery for Israel.
Chapter 38, Zechariah.
Zechariah is virtually a little book of Revelation, and we have that here in Isaiah.
Chapter 39 would deal with Malachi.
Malachi, of course, the Son is coming, the Son of righteousness with healing in his wings.
And so we have the first 39 chapters of Isaiah and their alphabetic meaning, the design to explain actually what Genesis also did, provides a topical index for the books of the Old Testament. On our next program, we'll get into the rest of Isaiah and the New Testament.